The Christmas Tree King, a love triangle that turned deadly. Act 1, The King of Christmas Trees. In 1950, Christmas in San Diego wasn't just about festive lights and holiday cheer. It was also big business, especially for one man. Harry A. Pozner, known as the Christmas Tree King, had built an empire supplying thousands of fresh trees every year. But beneath the bright holiday spirit, danger lurked. The Christmas tree business was fiercely competitive, and in some cities, it wasn't uncommon for sabotage, theft, and even violence. However, in Harry's case, his greatest threat wouldn't come from a business rival, it would come from his own love life. Pozner's business was thriving. He had connections with suppliers up north, ensuring that his trees arrived fresh, their deep green needles untouched by the California sun. He operated large lots across the city, where families would eagerly pick out the perfect tree for their holiday celebrations. Every December, his name was on the lips of thousands of San Diego residents as they prepared for the most magical time of the year. But while he was known for delivering the perfect Christmas tree, his personal life was far from picture perfect. Behind the festive storefronts and holiday advertisements, a storm was brewing. Harry was a married man. His wife, Margarette Pozner, had been by his side through years of hard work and expansion. Together, they had built a stable life. But Harry's success in business wasn't the only thing growing, so was the closeness between him and a woman who had been with him since the early days of his Christmas tree empire. Her name was Verna Simons, a striking woman with vibrant red hair and an air of quiet confidence. She had been his secretary and bookkeeper since 1943, working closely with him through every season of the business. She knew the finances, the logistics, the suppliers, and even the personal side of Harry's life. Their long hours together forged a bond that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Rumors began to swirl. Employees whispered about their private meetings. Late-night inventory checks turned into hours of hushed conversations behind closed doors. Margarette, a woman of sharp intuition, had noticed the changes in her husband, the extra care he took in his appearance, the sudden unexplained absences. At first, she pushed the thoughts aside. Maybe it was just business stress. Maybe she was imagining things. But as the months passed, the tension in their marriage became undeniable. And soon, Margarette would receive the confirmation she feared most. Act 2, The Love Triangle takes shape. Verna Simons had been by Harry's side since 1943, working as his bookkeeper and secretary. Their connection grew over the years, but how deep did it go? Margarette, Harry's wife, began to suspect the worst. Then, in early 1950, Verna made a bold move. She filed a lawsuit, claiming that Harry was the father of her 5-year-old son, Martin. Pozner denied it. A judge ruled in his favor, but the damage was already done. If he wasn't the father, why had he been paying for Verna's hospital bills? Why had he supported the child financially all those years? Margarette wanted answers. And she wasn't the only one. Someone who claimed to be madly in love with Verna decided to stir the pot. This mysterious individual contacted Margarette, feeding her worst fears. That call might have been the final push that set everything in motion. Margarette had spent months drowning in suspicion. The late nights, the whispers, the gut feeling that something wasn't right. But now, she had confirmation. It wasn't just paranoia, it was real. Harry had been lying to her. And worse, he had been lying for years. Margarette wasn't the only one affected. If Verna's claims were true, her son Martin had spent his entire life without the public acknowledgement of his father. And now, she was fighting to change that. She wasn't just looking for financial support, she wanted the truth to be known. But Harry Pozner was a man with a reputation to protect. He had built an empire. He couldn't afford to be exposed. So he did what he thought was necessary. He denied everything. Even though Verna had evidence, even though she had stood by his side for years, he refused to acknowledge any connection to Martin beyond financial support. He thought he had escaped this scandal unscathed. But Margarette wasn't about to let it go. She had spent too many nights crying, too many days pretending everything was fine. The betrayal was more than she could handle. And with that phone call, something inside her snapped. It was no longer just about an affair. It was about revenge. Act 3, A Deadly Confrontation. April 13, 1950. The air was crisp, a slight breeze rustling the awnings of the small cafe on the quiet street. The glow from the neon sign flickered, casting a faint blue hue onto the sidewalk. Verna Simon stepped out of Harry Pozner's car, adjusting her coat, glancing around, completely unaware that her life was about to change forever. From the shadows, a figure stood waiting Margarette Pozner. She had been there for hours, her heartbeat steady, her fingers tightening around the cool metal of a .32 caliber pistol tucked inside her handbag. She had watched them pull up, had seen them exchange hushed words. And now, the moment had come. Margarette took slow, deliberate steps forward. The sound of her heels clicking against the pavement made Verna pause. Their eyes met. A moment of realization. A moment of fear. Margarette's voice was sharp, dripping with contempt. "So you're with him again?" The words cut through the night like a blade. Before Verna could react, before she could turn or speak, Margarette lunged forward, gripping the pistol like a hammer, bringing it down hard against the side of Verna's head. The blow sent Verna off balance. Her hand shot out, reaching for the cafe door, but Margarette didn't stop. Another strike this time, Verna's body twisted, her knees buckling as she slumped onto the cold concrete. A small gasp escaped her lips. And then the shot. A deafening crack. A flash of fire from the barrel. The bullet hit its mark, Verna's forehead. For a fraction of a second, silence followed. The street, once empty, was now a frozen moment in time. Verna's body wavered, then collapsed, her red hair spilling across the pavement like silk, her breath escaping in shallow, broken gasps. The commotion brought Evelyn Simons, Verna's sister, running. Her scream shattered the night. Bystanders rushed forward, drawn by the gunshot. Margarette stood motionless, the gun still in her grip. Her breathing was heavy, her shoulders rising and falling. But there was no sign of remorse, only something cold, something distant in her expression. Then, she turned her gaze, landing on Harry, who had barely stepped out of the car before witnessing the horror unfold. For the first time in his life, Harry Pozner was speechless. He had built an empire, had navigated through cutthroat business deals, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. Margarette met his gaze and, in a voice devoid of emotion, uttered words that would haunt him forever. "I killed her, and you were supposed to be next." Harry instinctively grabbed for the gun, his fingers brushing against the warm barrel. But Margarette let it go. She didn't run. She didn't beg for forgiveness. Instead, she lifted her chin and smirked. "Go and hug her now," she sneered. "You're not worried about the mess, you're worried because you won't have her anymore." The street, once so quiet, erupted into chaos. The distant wail of sirens grew louder. Police cars skidded to a stop, officers jumping out, their weapons drawn. A crowd had gathered, whispers and gasps spreading through the spectators. But Margarette didn't move. She stood tall as the officers approached, as handcuffs were snapped onto her wrists. When asked if she had anything to say, she shrugged and muttered words that left officers uneasy. "I did it, and I'm glad I did it." Verna was still breathing barely. Paramedics worked frantically, lifting her onto a stretcher, her body limp, her forehead slick with blood. As they rushed her toward the ambulance, the realization sank in. Time was slipping away. Harry stumbled forward, reaching for her hand, whispering her name. But she couldn't respond. She couldn't see him anymore. The light in her eyes had already begun to fade. For the next few hours, doctors fought to keep Verna alive. Machines beeped, nurses moved in a blur. But deep down, they knew the damage was too severe. The bullet had shattered more than just bone, it had shattered any hope of survival. And then, as the clock neared dawn, the inevitable happened. The heartbeat monitor flatlined. The room fell silent. Verna Simons, the woman caught in a love triangle she never expected, was gone. The festive world of Harry Pozner had just turned into a crime scene. The Christmas tree king, once admired, was now a man shattered. His secret affair had come to light in the most brutal way possible, and nothing, not money, not power, could undo the damage. And Margarette? She had done exactly what she set out to do. She had ended it. But the real question remained, would the law see her as a scorned woman who acted in a moment of passion? Or would she be judged as a cold-blooded killer? Act 4, The Arrest and Trial. The night was far from over. As the flashing lights of police cars bathed the street in red and blue, officers secured the crime scene. The Christmas tree king himself, Harry Pozner, stood motionless, his world shattered, while Margarette Pozner was led away in handcuffs. Her expression? Cold. Unmoved. She had done exactly what she intended to do. And she wasn't sorry. Reporters swarmed outside the station as word of the murder spread. Headlines were already being printed: Love triangle ends in bloodshed. Christmas tree king's wife shoots mistress. Cameras flashed as Margarette was escorted inside, but she barely acknowledged them. Her only words to the officers: "I did it, and I'm glad I did it." Inside the station, detectives wasted no time. Margarette was brought to an interrogation room, the stark overhead light casting shadows across her face. She sat straight-backed, hands folded neatly in front of her. There was no trembling, no panic, only an eerie calm. When asked if she regretted her actions, she smirked and replied, "I don't regret a thing." She had it coming. She didn't even ask for a lawyer. Instead, she leaned back in her chair and began to recount, in chilling detail, how she had waited, how she had planned, and how she had watched Harry drop Verna off, knowing exactly what she was about to do. The trial began just 1 month later. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, onlookers, and curious residents filled the benches, eager to hear the scandal unfold. The prosecution wasted no time. They painted Margarette as a woman consumed by jealousy and revenge, a wife scorned who had spent months plotting how to eliminate the other woman. This was not a crime of passion, they argued. This was a premeditated execution. They brought forward a key witness, the cafe owner, Evelyn Simons, who had witnessed the moment of the shooting. Her testimony sent a wave of gasps through the courtroom. "I saw her standing over Verna's body," Evelyn recalled, voice trembling. "She looked down and said, 'I told you I would kill you.' And then she turned to Harry and said, 'You were supposed to be next.'" Harry Pozner himself was called to the stand. The once powerful businessman looked exhausted, his face drawn, his voice weak. Under oath, he admitted what everyone already suspected. Yes, he had been having an affair. Yes, Verna had filed a lawsuit claiming he was the father of her child. Yes, he had been paying her hospital bills and providing financial support. But did he love Verna? That was the question everyone wanted answered. Harry hesitated. And then, finally, he said it, "I don't know. But I never meant for any of this to happen." Margarette listened without reaction. She didn't flinch, didn't cry. If she felt anything about Harry's confession, she didn't show it. And then, when it was her turn to testify, she took a deep breath and said, "I don't remember pulling the trigger." The defense shifted the narrative. Margarette hadn't committed murder. She had suffered a mental blackout. 2 psychiatrists were brought in to testify, stating that Margarette had reached a breaking point after enduring months of emotional distress. She hadn't planned to kill Verna, they claimed. She had only planned to scare her. Margarette herself insisted on this version of events. "I only wanted to shoot out one of Harry's tires so we could talk things over," she said. "I was standing in the cafe waiting for them, but when I stepped outside, Verna raised her hands like she was going to scratch out my eyes. And then, the gun went off." She insisted that she had no memory of pulling the trigger. "I didn't even realize the gun had gone off," she said, shaking her head. "One moment, I was standing there. The next, she was on the ground." The case seemed clear. The evidence was strong. The eyewitness testimony was damning. But then, the jury began to deliberate. And what should have been an open and shut case, suddenly wasn't. Act 5, a shocking verdict. The courtroom was silent, save for the faint scratching of pens on paper as the jury deliberated. The evidence was strong. Margarette had admitted to the shooting. Witnesses had testified. The prosecution had painted a clear picture of a jealous wife consumed by rage, determined to eliminate her rival. It should have been an open and shut case. And yet, something wasn't sitting right with the jury. Was Margarette a cold-blooded killer? Or was she, as the defense claimed, a woman pushed beyond her breaking point, a victim of overwhelming emotional distress? Hour after hour, they debated. Was it premeditated murder, or an accident in a moment of heated confrontation? Did Margarette truly black out when she pulled the trigger, or was it an excuse to escape justice? And so, the night stretched on. A decision had to be made. The fate of Margarette Pozner, killer or victim, was in their hands. Morning arrived, and with it, the moment of truth. The jury filed back into the courtroom, their faces tired but resolute. Everyone held their breath as the foreman stood, unfolding the small slip of paper that held Margarette's fate. The judge asked the question that had hung over the case for weeks: how does the jury find the defendant? A pause. Then, the words that would send shockwaves through the room: not guilty. The room exploded. Some gasped. Some shouted. Others sat frozen in disbelief. How? How could a woman who had openly admitted to the shooting walk free? But the jury had spoken. Margarette Pozner would not spend the rest of her life behind bars. Margarette's reaction was instant. A gasp, followed by tears streaming down her face. Was it relief? Was it gratitude? Perhaps even disbelief at her own fortune? Whatever it was, she was free. And then the unthinkable happened. From across the room, Harry Pozner rose to his feet. The man who had lost his mistress in a violent tragedy. The man who had testified against his own wife. And yet he walked straight to Margarette. In front of a stunned crowd, he took her hand. The same man who had spent years tangled in a secret affair, who had risked everything, who had nearly lost his own life that night, was now standing by the woman who had nearly shot him, too. The world watched in stunned silence as Harry Pozner and Margarette walked out of the courtroom together. Arm in arm, as if the past few months had never happened. A reporter called out, asking Harry if he truly forgave his wife. His answer? "I'll do everything I can to make it up to my wife if she gives me the opportunity." And just like that, the love triangle that had turned deadly had come full circle. The affair was over. The mistress was gone. And the man who had spent years torn between two women? He had made his choice. Margarette Pozner had survived not just the trial, but the scandal, the whispers, the judgment. And as she walked away from the courthouse, her husband beside her, one question remained: had justice truly been served? Act 6, what happened next? If you thought that was the end of the story, think again. 10 years later, in 1960, Harry Pozner was still standing. Despite the scandal, despite the trial, despite the loss of Verna Simons, he had rebuilt his life. And his business? Bigger than ever. That year, a local television station filmed him in action, delivering thousands of Christmas trees to Balboa Park, one of San Diego's most treasured holiday destinations. The man once at the center of a sensational murder trial now spoke cheerfully to reporters, discussing the logistics of transporting 65,000 trees to meet the holiday demand. Harry had perfected his operation. The trees were sourced from the north, carefully preserved in refrigerated storage, and transported with precision. The Christmas tree king was still the king. But behind the business success, one question lingered. What happened to the woman who pulled the trigger? Margarette Pozner had vanished from the public eye. After her acquittal, she retreated into a life of quiet obscurity. The newspapers eventually lost interest, and in time, the public moved on. But in the privacy of her own home, Margarette remained a woman forever tied to one fatal night. Had she found peace? Or had the weight of her actions followed her into every waking moment? It's possible that Margarette and Harry tried to live as if nothing had happened. Maybe they spent the holidays together, wrapping gifts, pretending they were just another family celebrating under a Christmas tree that Harry himself had provided. But there was no erasing the past. No undoing the moment when Margarette stood over Verna's body, gun in hand. And what about the one person who lost the most that night? Martin Simons. The boy who had grown up believing Harry Pozner was his father. The child Verna fought to protect, the child who lost his mother in an instant. Martin was just 5 years old when Verna was taken from him. He was too young to understand the courtroom battles, the headlines, the verdict that set his mother's killer free. But as the years passed, the weight of what happened that night in April 1950 would follow him. What did he think of Harry? Of Margarette? Did he ever seek justice in his own way? One thing is certain: Verna Simons never got her justice. There was no punishment, no consequence for the person who ended her life. And yet, life went on. The world forgot. The city moved forward. And Harry Pozner? He continued selling Christmas trees, year after year. Asked how many Christmas trees he had handled in his career, Harry Pozner chuckled and shook his head. I don't have the slightest idea. It was an answer that might have applied to more than just trees. Maybe he didn't know how many trees he had sold. Maybe he didn't know how many lies he had told. Maybe, in the end, he didn't even know who he had loved.